In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, victorious Israeli forces began to construct fortifications along the Suez Canal in order to protect Sinai. Known as the Bar-Lev Line, it stretched around 100 miles from the Gulf of Suez in the south, to the Mediterranean in the north. Along the line were 30 strategically placed strong points, known as mausim, each screened by a sandbank several meters high. To the east of the canal, two roads, the Artillery Road and the Lateral Road, permitted easy transport of forces throughout the front. The Egyptians responded to this construction by launching sustained artillery strikes on the new Israeli positions, and sending commando raids into Israel, beginning the so-called War of Attrition. Israel responded with its own commando operations and an airborne offensive directed at the Egyptian air defense system, an assault designed to pressure Egypt into accepting a ceasefire. President Nasser realized the threat of Israeli air superiority had to be solved, and flew to Moscow to obtain more advanced SA-2 and SA-3 surface-to-air missiles, technicians and combat pilots from the Soviets. August 7, 1970 saw a 6-month ceasefire brokered by the U.S., preserving the status quo in the region. The war of attrition had drained Israeli morale, and proved that the Israeli Air Force could be countered. Nasser wouldn't live to see the results, as he died on September 28, 1970 and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. Sadat signed a 15-year treaty of friendship with the Soviets, and tried to make peace with Israel, asking them to redeploy the IDF 32 kilometers east of the Suez Canal, beyond the strategic passes. The Israelis refused and Sadat settled on a war as the only option left by May 1971. Though the Soviets continued to ship armaments to Egypt, including numerous Scud missiles, the hesitance of Brezhnev to support Egypt, and relatively warmer relations between the USSR and US in this period, resulted in the eventual expulsion of Soviet personnel from Egypt by mid-1972. Sadat then turned to Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad, and persuaded him that the lands lost in 1967 should be returned. Pledges of financial aid from oil-rich Saudi Arabia and Qatar were secured, along with promises of troops and aircraft from the Saudis, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Sudan and Iraq, though most of these contingents wouldn't arrive in time. Sadat was realistic and knew that his army wouldn't be able to utterly defeat the IDF in the field, and so wanted a limited war instead. He and his allies would launch a surprise attack across the Suez Canal and Golan Heights, break Israel's myth of invincibility, and use diplomatic pressure to secure a favorable peace. The Yom Kippur War was preceded by events on each front which adversely affected Israeli perceptions of the military situation. On September 7, 1973, Syrian fighters were scrambled to intercept an Israeli reconnaissance aircraft, and a battle developed 200 kilometers northwest of Israel over the Mediterranean. The dogfight, which resulted in 13 downed Syrian planes and no Israeli aircraft, allowed the Syrians to concentrate its forces on the Golan Heights without suspicion. They appeared to just be showing force after the aerial skirmish. In the south, Egyptian armies concentrated their forces along the Suez Canal under the cover of a training exercise. The image of normalcy was also maintained in an attempt to deceive the IDF. Soldiers walked along the canal without wearing helmets, they continued to fish in the canal, and false criticisms of Egyptian-used Soviet equipment were planted in Cairo newspapers. Nevertheless, IDF observation still noticed unusual amounts of military activity in the area. When this situation was discussed by Israeli High Command on September 30, Intelligence Chief, Major General Eli Zira, assured the government that the probability of war was low. After details of the Egyptian offensive, known as Operation Badr, were received at 0400 hours on the morning of October 6, preparations began for mobilization, but it was far too late. Just before 2 p.m. on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism's calendar, more than 200 Egyptian aircraft flew low over the Suez canals, launching strikes on Israeli Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries, airfields, command posts and other infrastructure in Sinai. The attacks were successful, but Egypt lost 40 aircraft to air combat and ground fire. At the same time, two Tu-16 bombers flew over the Mediterranean and launched AS-5 Kelt missiles at Tel Aviv. To show the Israelis any attempt at strategic bombing would be met in kind. In Sinai, 14 more Tupolev bombers successfully attacked targets in the Sinai Desert. The bombardment on land began at the same time as over 2,000 artillery pieces, including howitzers, heavy mortars, and even Katyusha rocket launchers, began to hammer the Bar-Lev line, supplemented by specially placed tanks atop the sand ramparts. During the first minute of Operation Badr, it's estimated that around 10,500 shells hit the first line of Israeli defense. Shortly after the bombardment began, specialized Egyptian tank hunter squadrons, armed with RPGs and Malyutka anti-tank missiles, crossed the Suez Canal and occupied ambush positions at pre-planned Israeli tank emplacements. Behind them were two Egyptian armies. The second was in the north commanded by Major General Ma'aman, and the third was to the south, led by Major General Wazel. Together they were composed of 5 infantry, 2 armored and 3 mechanized divisions, along with a number of independent brigades. The infantry formations especially possessed units with massive quantities of anti-tank weaponry, designed to counter Israeli armor-heavy assaults. Assaults across the entire front began in waves at 2:40 p.m., and the engineering corps breached the high sandbanks by utilizing high-pressure water hoses. At the same time, deployment of Soviet-made folding bridges began in order to facilitate the crossing of Egyptian armor and artillery. Over the coming days, Israeli Air Force jets would be bogged down constantly attacking these bridges, suffering massive losses from the Egyptian air defense umbrella in the process. In essence, the Israelis' greatest weapon was made virtually useless. The waves of infantry pushed several kilometers inland and established a defensive front, while specially trained units dealt with the Muslim strong points, which were gradually captured or surrendered. Along almost the entire line, IDF armored columns instinctively rushed to the front in order to relieve the strong points, but were badly mauled and repulsed by the aforementioned anti-tank squadrons lurking in ambush. Israeli headquarters was in utter confusion at the startling Egyptian success and, by dawn, faced tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, hundreds of tanks and vast quantities of both land and anti-aircraft artillery batteries, as well as SAM sites on the eastern bank. On the 8th, an armored IDF counterattack by 2 tank divisions was launched under Major Generals Avraham Adon and Ariel Sharon, but was again repulsed with devastating losses at the hands of artillery fire and anti-tank infantry. Although fierce fighting continued after the assault, the IDF managed to stabilize the Sinai Front by October 9, with Ariel Sharon's armored division intelligently maneuvering and destroying 50 Egyptian tanks a day later. Sadat's armies had achieved their limited objective and had repulsed an Israeli counterattack with massive losses, but pressure on the similarly active Syrian front on the Golan Heights necessitated a further Egyptian offensive to relieve it, as Israel had concentrated its forces there. The IDF High Command had been paralyzed with indecision before this point, but knowledge of this upcoming Egyptian attack made the course of action very clear: block it, crush it, and counterattack. On October 14, hundreds of heavy guns opened up along the artillery road, while fighter-bombers attacked Israeli ground targets in preparation for the attack. In the northern sector, the Egyptian 18th Infantry Division and a brigade of T-62 tanks attacked from El Kantara to Ramali. Here, Aden's division threw the Egyptians back to their origin point, destroying at least 50 tanks. In the center, Ariel Sharon's division bore the brunt of 21st Armored Division's assault leading from Ismailia, which met similar punishment to its northern counterpart. In this fighting, the 14th Armored Brigade destroyed 93 tanks of the Egyptian 1st Armored Brigade, essentially destroying it as a fighting unit. South of Sharon, an Egyptian armored thrust by the 4th Armored Division and 3rd Armored Brigade was aimed at the Gidi and Mitla passes, only to be turned back at the cost of 60 tanks, and was almost totally annihilated by the IAF. The Egyptians were advancing and lost their anti-air umbrella, leaving them dangerously vulnerable to air attack. Further south, an Egyptian task force consisting of an infantry and tank brigade attacked towards Ras Sudar along the Gulf of Suez, but was repulsed with ease by Major General Yeshaya Gavish. The attacks turned into a massive armored battle. In just 2 hours, the catastrophic Egyptian offensive had been decisively defeated. Of the 400 tanks committed to it, 260 had been destroyed and the way was clear for a massive Israeli counterattack. They had lost just 20 vehicles. The tide of the war had shifted, and the Egyptians were hemmed back into their beachheads. The Israelis now favored the idea of crossing the Suez Canal and forcing Egypt into a ceasefire, something which was made increasingly plausible because of U.S. aid in the form of Operation Nickel Grass. A broadly outlined plan named Stonehearted Man, or Operation Gazelle, had been drawn up before the war for this very scenario. After it was tuned for the situation, it called for laying 2 bridges across the canal near Fort Matsmed, a location which was in a mile-wide gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies. When this was done and the Israelis had crossed, they should capture a 50-mile-wide area between Mount Attica and the outskirts of Ismailia, before preparing a thrust on Cairo. The operation's main thrust would be conducted by the Maverick tank commander Ariel Sharon's 143rd Division which, at 1,600 hours on the 15th of October, began its attack. Tuvia Raviv's 600th Reserve Armored Brigade was sent on a frontal, diversionary assault along the Tasa Ismailia Road, while Amnon Reshef's 14th Brigade approached the Turdur Lexicon crossroad. From this point, sections of his force began experiencing fire at the hands of stubborn Egyptian defenders, who were stalwartly entrenched at an agricultural facility known as the Chinese Farm, just north of the planned corridor to the canal. Israeli armored columns, attacking from the front, flanks and rear, managed to briefly clear the Akavish Road, allowing a parachute brigade, commanded by Colonel Danny Matt, and some bridging equipment to get through, but stubborn enemy resistance soon closed the road behind Reshef's unit. The secondary Turdur Road remained totally blocked by Egyptian defenders, and Israeli logistics began to have problems. As a brutal, confused night engagement began at the Chinese Farm, Ariel Sharon ordered his parachutists to cross the channel in boats, which they did by 2:40 a.m. on the 16th, having been delayed by logistical gridlock on the only open road. By 8 a.m., Matt's bridgehead stretched 3 miles north of the Great Bitter Lake, catching some Egyptians on the other bank by surprise and securing some more canal crossings in the process. This assisted in ferrying more tanks over to the bridgehead, with which the Israeli spearhead began to launch raids west to destroy Egyptian SAM sites and punch holes into the enemy's air defense web. Egypt's high command was not overly concerned about the crossing, but ordered a counterattack to snap the IDF corridor shut nonetheless. It would be conducted in the north by the 21st Armored Division, attacking from the Chinese Farm, and in the south by the 25th Armored Brigade, moving up the lake shore. So, on the morning of October 17, Egypt's pincer was launched, but the Israelis already knew they were coming. In the north, 3 concentrated IDF armored brigades blunted and smashed the Egyptian attackers, who withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. Near the Great Bitter Lake, Colonel Reshef's armor managed to ambush and encircle the Egyptian 25th, pushing it against the water before annihilating it with intense artillery and tank fire. By 5:30 p.m. the same day, 85 of 96 enemy T-62s had been destroyed and the counterattack repelled. By the 19th of October, even the battle at Chinese Farm had come to an end when Reshef attacked the exhausted defenders, conclusively pushing them north after heroic resistance. Across the Suez, additional bridges were slowly brought to bear as the hours passed, including a monstrous prefabricated roller bridge, which had been painstakingly towed from miles away by more than a dozen tanks. This increase in crossing points allowed multiple armored brigades to more efficiently reinforce the bridgehead, known now as the agricultural buffer, due to the farms and irrigation canals in the area. Israeli armor also began to mass for a breakout. Egypt's high command had decisively underestimated the so-called television operation that crossing the canal represented. It was instead a serious strategic threat. At dawn on October 18, 3 IDF brigades under Major General Ariel Sharon, Brigadier General Kalman Magan and Major General Avraham Adon burst out of the bridgehead from all angles, pushing northwest, west and south respectively. By the point in the war, IAF jets were increasingly launching lethal support missions as the Egyptian SAM sites were hunted by ground troops in the desert. While Sharon's northern thrust up the Sweetwater Canal towards Ismailia was slow-going and met with dogged resistance, the forces under Adon and Magan smashed through hostile lines with relative ease. By midday on October 21, Egypt's Third Army in the southern sector was cut off from its rear lines. The great powers were now beginning to take note, and neither the Soviets nor the Americans wanted a major war to break out. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev eventually reached ceasefire terms under UN Security Council Resolution 338, which was set to go into effect at 6 p.m. on the 22nd. Hostilities came to a halt in the north relatively smoothly, with Sharon capturing a series of bridges on the Ismailia-Suez road before it did. In the south, however, it took until the 25th for a solid peace to be achieved, by which time Adon had reached the port of Suez. While the war's hostilities officially came to an end, skirmishes continued unofficially for months. Though final military victory had gone to Israel, its government and population were shocked by early Egyptian successes. The so-called Agranat Commission, an Israeli governmental body appointed to discover the failures which led to these defeats, eventually led to the end of multiple political careers, including that of Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir, in addition to many more military figures. To the Egyptians, Anwar Sadat had gained a famous victory rather than a defeat, and his armed forces could hold their heads high in the knowledge that their crossing of the canal on Yom Kippur had been a maneuver of great skill and bravery. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to our channel Pouring Knowledge for more videos like these.